Official welcome to the intersection of System of Care and Family First Prevention Services. We have an incredible speaker with us today. That's Richard Connect, who I am so excited to introduce because I know he's got a lot of great content. So Richard Connect is a marriage and family therapist by training and has delivered program operations, leadership, strategic planning, and training services to public and private healthcare and human service systems for more than 30 years. He is recognized in California for his work in designing, adapting, and implementing integrated and trauma-informed systems of care for public human service agencies. Richard serves as the Integrated Services Advisor to the California Department of Social Services. He is the author of 2 children's books. The latest, Scary But Not Very, helps parents talk with young children about personal resilience in the face of trauma. And with that, we want to say welcome, Richard. We're so grateful to have you, and we look forward to your presentation today.
Jessica, thanks a ton, and appreciation at the outset to you and Dana and Haley and Jennifer and the whole team at Caltrin for helping us come into conversation today about a couple of my favorite things. And thanks to the participants for joining us. I see some familiar names and faces. So thrilled to be able to spend a little more than an hour with you all talking about this critical intersectionality between the system of care work that is happening across the state and the comprehensive prevention planning work. These things were really made for each other. They're highly complementary. And we're going to really dive deep, I think, if you've been with us a time or two in other training sessions or conversations. We've touched on a couple of these principles, but today we are appreciative of having the time to just dig in and talk about some examples. And along those lines, would love to welcome reflections and inquiry, of course, from each of you as participants. Each of you has some experience in these areas that may deepen the learning. And so we hope that you'll see today as really a facilitated conversation as much as anything else. So feel free to toss your questions liberally into chat or raise your hands, and together the team and I will try to get to all that content that we hope will come forward. There are really 4 areas that we're going to try to loosely divide our conversation around. The first is that some context here is super, super important. And there are a number of aspects of that context that will make comprehensive prevention planning and good prevention work, implementation work successful. We are going to spend a little bit of time talking about Assembly Bill 2083 and the system of care, assuming that some of you may not be directly involved in the system of care planning in your county or your region. And so we're going to orient to that and talk about how that creates opportunities for prevention work. Some of you may be more savvy on the system of care side and may be new to the comprehensive prevention planning or FFPSA Part 1 work. And so we'll spend a moment or two orienting to that. And then the heart and soul of the conversation today is how we use the system of care functions or some of the functions that are inherent within the system of care to design and implement good prevention work going forward. So that's where we're going to go. And so let's start our kind of contextual conversation here with some terms and definitions. These are very kind of high level, but the federal act that allows us to waive previously limited foster care dollars and use those in a preventative diversionary way is known as FFPSA. It's got 8 parts, right? And we're going to be talking about part 1. The state has astutely been approved for a plan to implement FFPSA, and underneath Assembly Bill 153, we're affectionately calling that the Family First Prevention Services Program. And I think 50 counties, 49 or 50 counties and 2 or 3 tribes have opted into that voluntary waiver opportunity. Some of you, perhaps all, have seen the very thoughtful letter from March of last year, almost a year old now, that outlines the comprehensive prevention planning opportunity and obligations for a county or tribe that's opting in. That's known as the Comprehensive Prevention Plan. And that's what many of you are in the middle of developing right now with your partners. And then the System of Care, authored in California under AB 2083, is a set of agreements that's captured in a memorandum of understanding that talks about how at least 5 agencies and departments in your county and region are going to approach their shared responsibilities to serve kids and families. And within that System of Care agreement, there's an opportunity and obligation to form an interagency leadership team, a backbone, if you will, of decision-making and guidance for the System of Care. And the first connection point to CPP work or prevention work is within that guidance process, prevention work, and the CPP is one aspect of that. And we'll be talking about that in some detail. So let's dive deeper into context. And this is my favorite and most important, I think. And we'll talk about why. On the screen, you have some examples here, graphic pictures, if you will, of the universal wholeness that's present in our world, our universe. It starts in our biology at the cellular level. If you come up biologically a couple of levels, our bodily systems are all interdependent and interconnected. If you're a musician and you play an instrument, you know that one instrument by itself can be beautiful, but it's unparalleled in terms of the harmonies and the beauty of a symphony or an orchestra, right? It changes the utility of the instrument to be part of a much larger system. Bottom left corner, a rope is nothing more than a set of strands, threads, that are woven together. And that rope is far more strong and useful than the individual threads are by themselves. In nature, I love this picture, 2 streams that naturally converge into wholeness, connectivity. And in the process of merging, one could imagine downstream that the river is cleansing itself, right? By being in collaboration or integration with another stream, the stream that's coming out of the north, which is traumatized upstream, you can see that, right? It's muddy water. It's cleansing itself naturally by the process of integration. Digitally speaking, nothing is more exemplary of the power of integration and wholeness, if you will, than the examples we find in technology. You have devices in your purse, your wallet, your home, all interconnected, and that innovation comes only with integration. And then finally, on the grandest scale, the universe is fully integrated. The planets, the stars are all interdependent upon one another. The spacing, the pull of those forces keeps us in harmony most of the time. So again, wholeness and integration are universal, and they are foundational to whole child, whole person care. And this creates a dilemma because in public systems, we are often not integrated. We are not whole. Over the past 4 or 5 decades, we have crafted attempts to solve the challenges of working with people in our communities who are traumatized, grieving, have experienced loss and suffering. And we've done this in a highly technical way, beginning with the federal government and at the state level, right? We're great about bringing technicalities forward to solve problems. We have reform initiatives, money, mandates, but each one of those over the decades gets layered on top of the others so that we end up then in an environment where we are now, a service ecology that is very, very heavy, very, very prescriptive, compliance-driven rules driven. And that imbalance robs us of the capacity then to think holistically and relationally. And this is a super important concept to understand, that to get to wholeness and healing, well-being, wellness, integration, connectivity, relationality is necessary. And we don't do that well in public systems, which is why system of care is so important, and why your CPP planning work is essentially a system of care function. In order to get to that kind of transformative opportunity, I'm fond of the writing and research of Ron Heifetz at the Harvard Business School, who's among a number of leaders over the last few years who have crafted some recommendations for us about how to think adaptively. Again, the solutions we have historically used, including FFPSA Part 1, it's a technical solution, unless we take that technical solution and we apply it in an adaptive, transformative way. Does this make sense? There's a difference, there's a fundamental difference between technicalities and the technical application of resources and using them adaptively. And comprehensive prevention planning demands adaptive transformational thinking. And really quickly here, Dr. Heifetz talks about getting on the balcony, right? So getting off the dance floor. His metaphor is a dance floor and a balcony, and leaders to think adaptively, transformationally, you have to get off the dance floor so that you can see the big picture, and do that frequently enough and consistently enough so that you don't get stuck on the dance floor where you can't see everything that's going on, right? And when we do that, we can then identify the adaptive challenges much more readily because we can see the big picture. And we can regulate then the resources and the distress that comes with the change or the implementation, the technicalities of it. It lets us maintain a focused discipline. Adaptive thinking allows us then to work with our teams at every level. We give people the work back in a thoughtful way instead of just layering the technicalities in, and allows us then to be responsive over time. We protect the voices of leadership from the swell of distress that comes when we are constantly doing reform, which is what we all experienced the last few years in California. The reform fatigue is enormous. So I just love Ron Heifetz's thinking on adaptive leadership, and would highly recommend a deep dive there. And it's useful constructs for us as we figure out how to transform ourselves underneath the comprehensive prevention planning process. It is an opportunity to see ourselves in a new light. We're going to get out of this structured, siloed, prescriptive way of seeing just probation kids, just welfare kids, just special ed kids, and just regional center, developmentally, intellectually challenged kids, right? And we see then all young people in our constituency as being our responsibility. And we do that authentically and consistently. And this is a prime imperative for transformation to succeed, and very difficult for organizational leaders to do. The reason it's important is that if we reduce the number of youth and families who enter foster care without integrating the systems, we will do what we have always done, which is simply moving kids back and forth. We transform something in welfare or mental health, and we get better at it. But what inadvertently leads to is kids needing services from other systems, and we end up just shuffling kids around our system and not serving them in a more integrated way. We're going to have to then figure out how to share power and responsibility and do this collective work like never before. CPP really demands that of us, which makes it such a powerful opportunity, and one I think that's truly going to be transformative. When we get to that place where we are thinking and acting in our design work and implementation work in an adaptive way, transformative way, we're in a place then when where we'll see that our programs are funded by multiple sources. We'll talk more about this in terms of the blending and braiding of dollars. We are in partnership with community-based organizations and experts, subject matter experts who understand the work, including our youth and the parents who love and care for them. We have outcomes that are collectively measured across the system. And so we celebrate the successes in the entire system of care and not just in one department or one division. And we get to focus on the root causes of system entry when we're in an adaptive mentality. In order to do these really complex things, wholeness has to be understood and adaptive leadership has to be practiced. And when I say leadership, I'm not just talking about department heads and chiefs and superintendents. Leadership at every level of the organization, whatever department or agency you're with, behaving in this way, transformatively, adaptively, is leadership. And that's the opportunity that we have. And again, what CPP demands from us, if you will. A little more context, and then we'll pause and take reflections or questions here in a couple of more slides. But the adaptive transformative processes require and provide us an opportunity for seeing the world differently. And the fundamental driver for this is an awareness that financial scarcity for things like prevention services exists only when we are disconnected. When we are braided and blended together organizationally and financially, scarcity is mitigated or disappears altogether. Kudos and appreciation to my friends at the Placer County Office of Education for this lovely graphic that illustrates this. Each of these funding streams is susceptible to the whims and the ebbs and flows of funding. When you weave funding streams together, it's much stronger and insulated from any particular change across the system. We'll talk more about this as we go. So inherent in this transformative opportunity that is comprehensive prevention planning, and the reason that that comprehensive word is on the front end of this, it is for this reason, right? That we want something that's sustainable and complete. Otherwise, the state would have called it a prevention plan or a master prevention plan, right? But that's not what we call it. We call it a comprehensive prevention plan. Comprehensive meaning whole, right? Fully complete. When we have a good comprehensive prevention plan in place, we're going to recognize that the objectives of that plan are nearly identical to the well-established outcomes that are present in a high-functioning system of care. So here's where, on the back end, the measurement end, the outcomes end or outputs end, we're going to see that there's absolute synchrony between the goals of a comprehensive prevention initiative and the system of care. This data comes out of one of the National Technical Assistance Centers. It's a 35 years worth of aggregate research that suggests that these are the things that happen when we are integrated. And if you look at these, I'll pause here for a second and let you just ponder on these. These outcomes are largely the same outcomes you are pursuing underneath your CPP work. It'll depend locally, right, on what your population of focus is, what your target population is, and where you apply the opportunity. But largely, these outcomes are the same. And so it leads us to, again, synchrony, that the system of care goals, if we do that integration work largely in an effective way, we're positioned much more favorably to accomplish our comprehensive prevention planning goal. We'll hit this again one more time at the end. And if you're a visual processor like me, wanted to point out that within the CPP work, we have an algorithm, right? A formulary that suggests that there are primary, secondary, and tertiary aspects to prevention. And while that is a relatively new construct for many in the child welfare or probation arenas, it is not new to public health, and it's not new to our school partners, who are system of care partners and can be comprehensive prevention plan partners if we invite and allow and support that, right? So this idea of primary, secondary, tertiary prevention, it's pretty universal. And so by having our school and public health partners, among others, in this planning process and implementation process with us, we can leverage their cognitive frameworks and the maps that they have in place, because for decades, public health has been doing primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. So linking them all into system of care governance makes great sense from this aspect of creating this primary, secondary, and tertiary alignment of systems. And one more look graphically at this, the state has, I think, thoughtfully crafted an approach that will bring us into a system of well-being, right? That really has young people and their families in the context of their community thriving, not just recovering, not just mitigating trauma, but at some level preventing it, insulating ourselves from it. And this graphic, not inclusive, but each of these boxes is one of the aspects of prevention that various state organizations or the federal government is sponsoring, right? So this, again, not comprehensive, but here are 6 either historic or new or emerging opportunities within this larger prevention well-being lens, right? So we have historic child abuse prevention system, largely funded by OCAP, right? There are tremendous resources going forward right now in community schools. We have the Student Behavioral Health Incentive Program. There are historic First 5 programs under Prop 10. The California Advancing and Innovating Medicaid, Medi-Cal process reforms are in place or will be in the coming months. And it's an incredible opportunity to move in a whole child upstream methodology. Juvenile justice reforms, historic and future, and of course CalWORKS is a historic program. Again, 6 examples of many others that if brought into the same compartment underneath system of care, within system of care, we have this woven, tightly structured prevention methodology, a system for approaching prevention in our local communities or tribes. So let me pause there and just invite, I'll just double check in chat and see if we have questions or inquiry reflections yet. Happy to also have you raise your hand and offer any thoughts or inspiration that's occurred to you as we've gotten into some of the context. Any early reflections at this point? So let's begin to dive a little deeper and move from some conceptual ideas, transformation, adaptation, wholeness, well-being. Let's begin to move into the little more technical aspects of this and bridge into that. On the left, you have this visual that captures, again, some of, not all, but some of the early intervention prevention opportunities that are being done in your county or your region. There isn't a county in the state that doesn't have or could avail itself of all 7 of these approaches, opportunities, right? Funding streams and opportunities to transform themselves from a prevention lens. If they are connected within a, again, there's that word, comprehensive or holistic prevention plan, we will be able then to leverage the demands of each of these reforms, which are listed on the right? Each of these initiatives has an obligation for needs assessment, for planning and reporting, for accountability and compliance, to conduct analysis of data and measure impact. Each of them has fiscal dynamics, and each will have an impact on the equity, disproportionality, access, fairness conversations that are present, hopefully within your communities, right? So I hope then you begin to get a sense here that by spending the time and effort to connect ourselves with the other prevention efforts, we're going to leverage things like needs assessment work, right? And the planning and compliance, and the data and the fiscal. And we're going to dive deep in the next few minutes on a couple of areas where this is most salient and most accessible. The big irony here is that if we're not connected in these prevention efforts, we're going to continue throwing resources, often at the very same young people that some other system is targeting with their prevention work, right? Wasteful, redundant, sometimes confusing to the families that we're trying to serve. So there are lots of reasons for investing in a whole child prevention approach, which is what CPP helps us to do. So that's the big context on this. Let's explore a little bit about system of care, just to call this a primer, if you will, on systems of care. Systems of care are about a 40-year-old initiative now, largely championed by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, a division within the federal government. And there's this research-based definition that I'm going to give you a chance to ponder on. And just note in that definition the emphasis on integration and connection, impact on families, and that integrating at the management, service delivery, policy levels to create one infrastructure. These are all key words, but I can't ever remember them all. This definition is lovely, but way too wordy. And so I like to think of systems of care when people say, well, Richard, what's that system of care stuff that the state's doing? I just say, well, you know what? We're learning how to share responsibility, risk, and reward. The 3 R's of whole child, whole person care. If we can share responsibility, risk, and reward, then we're doing it. And the system of care, as we looked at the research a couple slides back, remember the outcomes? That's the pathway. It's the known pathway now to healing and wholeness of our systems. And system of care has some key principles. They have just undergone some revision with the technical assistance folks nationally. So if you're a wraparound expert or a person that's experiencing a wraparound, you'll recognize these. They have added, though, developmentally appropriate and a comprehensive continuum as a driver to system of care. There's that word again, comprehensiveness. So the system of care principles are universal, and these, of course, are present within every model that you'll be looking at under your CPP work. And then from the national level, we bring it into the state's effort under Assembly Bill 2083. There's a lovely expectation within that opportunity to craft a memorandum of understanding. And many of you are familiar with this, hopefully at this point. There are 11 expected, required, if you will, on some level, aspects or elements or functions within the system of care. And we've got these 11 listed here. And I have highlighted and italicized in red the 4 or 5 of these that we're going to talk more about today, and that are kind of more practically relevant when it comes to doing comprehensive prevention planning and implementation. The presence and the existence of and a function of a leadership team, how we screen, assess, and enter care from the various pathways that are present within a system of care, how we share data, how we coordinate services, and of course, the blending and braiding of dollars. Not that the other elements of the MOU are not important, but these are the ones that are most salient to comprehensive prevention planning. All right, that's a quick look at system of care. And not seeing any inquiry in chat. Let's look at a quick primer again on FFPSA. So we've taken a primer, we've seen some big context. We took a primer on system of care. Let's take a primer on FFPSA Part 1, and then we'll try to link them all together in the rest of our conversation. Part 1, 8 parts to FFPSA, right? Part 1 is, again, the impetus to AB 153, which establishes a program at the state level. It's a waiver. It gives us a chance to use dollars that previously had to be used for specific things, kind of for kids in foster care. We can actually keep them out. It's wonderful policy, and unfortunately has taken us way too long to get there at the federal level, but we're here now. And so we're grateful for that and the chance it gives us to actually move way upstream, right, to get to the headwaters. There are broad classifications or parameters around how and who can be served under that. And those are all established in the state's guidance to you. And the eligible prevention services have to pass through a consideration at both the federal and state level, the federal clearinghouse that establishes what can be delivered, and then the state has a plan that that further articulates which practices, models, if you will, although I'm not fond of that word in this context, which intervention strategies can be applied within a CPP plan, right? The state has 10 of those that they've supported, all approved in the clearinghouse. And we will talk a little bit about the utility of the $4 as the last federal resource to use. There's some complexity to that that's going to challenge us as we go forward. But that's a quick look at FFPSA. I think we've struck on most of these points already. I would just emphasize that since the advent of System of Care under AB 2083, the third bullet here is this is really the first major opportunity to kind of put the MOU to the test, right? That 2083 work, putting that into practice. Another important takeaway from this slide is that the CPP work very much reinforces and parallels the major reform efforts going on in CalAIM, the now 21-year-old Mental Health Services Act, and the California Youth Behavioral Health Initiative. Many, many parallels between CPP, FFPSA Part 1 and those other efforts. So this flood of opportunity and resource to do this right. It's an incredible opportunity in California. The CPP process and plan has 9 required elements. As you get into planning, the state has articulated that you've got to have a plan that addresses at least these 9 kind of functional areas, if you will. And we're going to talk about governance, and we're going to talk about data and reporting, and we're going to talk about fiscal and funding. So we're really going to talk about 1, kind of 2, 3, 5, and 8, if that makes sense, as we move forward. All right. So to illustrate this a little bit more concretely, on the left-hand side of your screen, we've listed 5 of those 11 elements that your System of Care MOU is supposed to articulate, right? This is a guiding document about how we live together, how we share responsibility, risk, and reward in X county. And these 5 elements, each, if they're well articulated and being practiced locally, have impact and influence. They set the stage for addressing the FFPSA and CPP planning process. And so, for instance, the financial resource management aspects of your MOU are designed to support critical CPP planning processes like what's your funding and fiscal model, and how are we going to pay for our prevention approaches, right? What will the program design look like? What are the reporting requirements, right? If our interagency leadership team, if our backbone is working at the System of Care level, we'll be way more ready than we would otherwise be for things like program and governance of the CPP plan, how we do our collaboration, what policies and rules locally do we need to adapt or change, how will we address the impacts on our workforce, and again, to reporting, right? The screening, assessment, and entry to care part of your MOU is designed to create structure, functional structure that allows us to articulate then how will we do our prevention services program design and what will the outcomes be? The staff recruitment, training, and coaching aspect of your MOU, of course, is designed to position you interagency-wise to deal with the workforce opportunities that are going to come with a CPP plan. And then finally, the information and data sharing aspects of your MOU are designed to support the timely use and the sharing of critical pieces of information, either at the macro level or the micro level, the outcome level or the client level, the youth level, right? So I hope it's clear then, or emerging anyway, that the reason that the MOU underneath a system of care was constructed the way it was and has these requirements in it is to position us locally to do things like all of these things that are required in a CPP plan. Any questions or reflections from folks around that? Is that resonating? Is it making sense? Anything you want to ponder on more deeply at this point? All right. So let's begin then to explore the three of these. We're going to talk about governance and its connectivity to the interagency leadership team, and we'll talk about funding and data. So I think it's essential to understand some of the governance requirements of the Comprehensive Prevention Plan and how the ILT supports that. I'm going to assume at this point that most of our planners locally in our counties and tribes have identified a governing body. It's my bias that that should be your ILT. There are other options. We'll talk about those in just a second. But I think we're at a place, if you look at the chronology and the due date that's coming with each passing day, right, for submission of a completed plan, hopefully we got leadership established as a governing body. But the state's given us some expectations here that this governance structure include the 4E agencies and that body be positioned, that group of people be positioned to set the direction and strategize and allocate the resources, make decisions to oversee the program, right? It should include and has to include stakeholder groups that can do that work and give us connection to provider networks, particularly if you're in a big county where you've got a broad network of community-based organizations. You're going to have to figure out the connective tissue and the process that allows the public sector leaders to govern, if you will, in collaboration with prevention providers in community. The collaborative structure that oversees it as governance certainly can have other ad hocs or committees to implement the plan. So I just want to be clear, I don't think the state is expecting that the ILT or department heads be the implementation team. Obviously, that's going to be at a different level of the organizations. But the sponsors of the 4E agencies ultimately are accountable for implementation. So they're going to have a role. So that governance body has to be clear in terms of where the 4E agencies have voice and where they exert their authority vis-a-vis governance. So we've talked about much of this already, but some of the detail here is that the governance body is expected to identify the key integration points, or has an opportunity anyway to identify the key integration points for the existing continuum of prevention services in light of the wavered money, right? And like how we're going to use this differently. It's important to ensure that we limit the redundancy, right? And that we don't create new gaps inadvertently. And so doing that requires us to attend to the federal and state fiscal requirements and do that in a uniform way and a consistent way so that there is one comprehensive prevention plan, not a smattering of prevention services that are disconnected and disjointed. And the governance body, again, has many other obligations ultimately to approve the plan, right? And be accountable as a collective. I want to pause here and go back to one of the contextual items we kicked off with was wholeness. The governance body members need to see themselves and be supported by you and others in your jurisdictions to see themselves as part of the whole governance body. I'm not just responsible for the accountabilities of youth corrections as the chief probation officer. I am responsible for the whole of my young people in collaboration with my partners. Same for the superintendent of schools, right? I'm not just responsible for academic outcomes and educational success of my young people in my county. I am responsible for this whole comprehensive approach and helping all kids succeed in whatever sector or service they're in. So there are some options for the construction of the governance body within CPP. The state doesn't say you got to use X people beyond what we've talked about. In some counties, they may choose the existing Child Abuse Prevention Council to be their governing body. Nothing wrong with that. I think you can make an argument in some counties that a high-functioning First Five Commission, if it's really deep, broad, and well-represented, that they could be a governance body. Or there may be a subcommittee in some counties of the First Five Commission that could serve as a governance body. Many counties have been participating in the OCAP-sponsored prevention cabinet work over the last 4 or 5 years. You could make a good argument that there could be a prevention cabinet group formed. If they're tightly connected and they're well-functioning, they could be the governance body, and it could be some other prevention coordination group. And then finally, the interagency leadership team, which again is my bias, that locating the governance body responsibility function for CPP within the system of care makes a great deal more sense in terms of the sustainability and the applicability of your plan once it's in place. The answer to which body to use, it depends, right? It depends on whether or not your ILT underneath your system of care is functioning effectively, and we'll talk about that in some detail here, and what the capacities and breadth and depth of your other governance bodies are. The foundational expectation of an interagency leadership team as a governing body is that you'll identify the candidate population within your CPP plan, right? So you have to bless the recommendation of the planners, of the CPP planners, to identify what's the population of focus. And you have to bless the parts of the plan that are that deal with what evidence-based program are we going to apply, and what are the interventions we're going to use and how, right? You're going to need to take responsibility as an ILT member for how to leverage and account for the funding, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Ultimately, focusing on readiness, that the CPP plan can only be effectively applied if it's done on an interagency level with the appropriate dialogue and relationality that's necessary for a good functioning backbone system in a system of care. Emphasis here on developing a full prevention continuum. And this is super complex in California. I will say that the FFPSA Part 1 implementation in California is far more complex, and we've had some national experts on previous calls and webinars like this that have affirmed that, right? They work in other states, and they're quick to say California is more complex. It's a wonderful complexity, and it's built on this awareness that we have over the years developed state-funded prevention and diversion services that other states don't have. So on some level, we're in a service environment that is far more well endowed. We have way more tools in the toolbox, but that makes the complexity of prevention, comprehensive prevention planning, more difficult, if that makes sense. And I've lifted here a quote in blue, a partial quote from the System of Care 2083 toolkit that some of you may have seen on the Health and Human Services webpage. One of the goals of the interagency leadership team is to ensure that the system's partners, programs, and policies are coordinated, integrated, and effective, right? And that's required also of the CPP work. So if your system of care has ILT is chosen as the governing body for the CPP work, it comes with some challenges, because your interagency leadership team has other agenda items and initiatives that it's dealing with. So you're going to have to find time within that ILT to weave in the CPP work. We have seen a number of counties start to do that really effectively already. A Another challenge is that you're going to have to connect that interagency leadership team meeting and the process to community partners and tribal communities and to people with lived experience, because in most cases, our local interagency leadership teams are not in kind of formal shared governance with youth, family, tribes yet. Okay, we have some counties that are, but in all cases, we're going to have to figure out how to bridge from the public interagency leadership team, department heads, superintendents, chiefs, to community, because the plan has to be community developed, right? And it'll be difficult to address diversity, equity, inclusion, overrepresentation issues if we are absent community input and tribal input, so to speak. The challenges are significant. The opportunities are immense. Once the goals of the initiatives are understood, it becomes really clear that using an integrated governance body like the System of Care ILT will allow us to most effectively weave together the information sharing, the data sharing, the alignment of our outcomes, the revenues that fund prevention, and how people will get access to the prevention service via a coordinated methodology. So choosing your ILT as the System of Care governance body brings challenges, but incredible opportunities, obviously. Among the arguments for why interagency leadership teams are best positioned to oversee the CPP governance is, and we'll talk about these in detail here in a few minutes, the partners have data about the needs and services that exist in existing reports and plans. Like historically, for decades, in some cases, we've been doing identical work. And so the data that we need for planning purposes, the information needed to inform a CPP plan, can be augmented or premised upon, connected to existing data. The partners have contracts or programs for prevention services that are already in place. And so we'll want to think about not being redundant. I was privy to a conversation in a county recently where not under FFPSA, but under a different grant opportunity from the state, they were pondering on developing or implementing 2 evidence-based parenting programs. And the team challenged itself because one of the members of this group, one of the planners, said, you know, we've been trying to do those same 2 programs for about 20 years underneath the Mental Health Services Act, and we can't spend all that money. We haven't been able to find all of the demand to meet the opportunity. So why are we planning to build more of those same 2 programs? It's a really logical question, right? And a question that speaks to kind of responsibility as a planner. The ILT partners have dollars that can be used to match the federal allocations, both the 4E and the Medicaid dollars that come to support prevention underneath a comprehensive prevention plan. They have local or state level match requirements, right? And so the partners bring that match in the form of certified public expenditure or cost reconciliation at year end, or in whatever way locally folks want to find and identify and account for that match. When done with fidelity and fullness, the System of Care ILT provides this transformative opportunity for sharing with parents, youth, and tribes to address the issues that are paramount. Exploring a little further, the utility of the interagency leadership team as your CPP governance body. If I were in a county where we had selected the interagency leadership team, here's a sample agenda that I am borrowing from a county where we're doing some of this work. So it's just a quick look at what that agenda would look like. And you can see in red, after welcoming and introducing and celebrating what's working, they do a program overview. And in one of their meetings last fall, they did an overview to the local control accountability report, which is the County Office of Education Initiative. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then they have this section on their agenda where they have shared initiatives. And they had 2 things. And one of them was the CPP update and needs. And that was presented by the probation and child welfare services leads who had put in the intention letter around AB 153 and opting in, right? So after they did that update to the ILT, they did a school grant implementation. The County Office of Education had won a Mental Health Services Act grant. We'll talk about that in a second. And then they went on to calendar and closing reflection. So just to give you an idea for what a structured agenda might look like that has space in it for comprehensive prevention planning, if that makes sense. And if my system of care interagency leadership team is the governance body, some of the critical questions I'm going to begin to invite them to is, well, what are the first steps that we need to begin planning? And in many counties, they're already into these steps, right? Because we do have some guidance from the state to this end. How will we coordinate that planning process? How will we develop a theory of change and a logic model? How will that logic model translate to a set of strategies? And what project management tools do we need to keep ourselves aligned so that we can get to June and July with a good CPP plan that the state will approve and support? Another question for the ILT executives would be, do our fiscal managers know and understand each other in a way that allows them to do the blending and braiding, this complex, technically complex revenue sharing that's inherent within a comprehensive prevention plan? What are the existing prevention services supports in place, and how are we going to leverage those? I was in a county event a number of months ago, and during a breakout exercise, one of the school folks was talking about developing a new program underneath a state-funded, a Department of Education-funded grant. And the chief probation officer said, well, we've been doing that evidence-based program with our young people for a couple of years now. And had they not had the interagency conversation, they would not have identified this redundancy and the opportunity for leverage, right? Other questions involve what data does each partner have or will have, and we're going to talk about that in a deep dive here in a couple of minutes, and how will our comprehensive prevention plan be measured, right? Okay. I'm going to speed up the pace here a little bit because we got, I want to make sure we have time for conversation on this. Here's a quick sample email as the ILT team in this county started diving into planning processes. Their planners took the initiative of making sure the ILT was aware that in an upcoming meeting, we're going to start talking about this. And they primed the pump with these, 3 of these critical questions as they began their analysis of where to spend their resources. So as we make this PowerPoint available to you afterwards, you'll have this sample ILT email if it's helpful. If your interagency team, so if you are selecting an ILT as your governance body, it's maybe possible that your interagency leadership team is not meeting on a routine, regular, effective schedule. So it's going to be super important that you engage members to more fully orient and educate them to these powerful opportunities, right? It's not intuitive. It won't dawn on any one of them alone. Only by being in that conversation will the connections be made, like the 1 or 2 examples I've described, right? If your ILT is meeting and working well enough, then you're well positioned to do this work. And if you are struggling, I always tell people, go get your presiding juvenile bench officer, go get your presiding juvenile judge to help you with this work. There is judicial code that supports their involvement in these kinds of efforts, including system of care. And they can be powerful forces. Where we see system of care most successfully on the ground in California now, it's often because the judge is present in those conversations. All right. So let me pause there. That's ILT and the governance body function. Any questions or further exploration folks want to make on that? And then we'll do a really quick look at the finance and funding. All right. So second element of the CPP required work that relates to system of care is finance and funding. And I've got listed here is a partial, not a complete list, partial list of some of the other ways that the state government typically, although some of these have federal connections, right, are funding prevention. So beyond the 4E waivered money, there are numerous other sources, including the community schools grants from the Department of Education, right? The Mental Health Services Act Prevention Early Intervention monies, first $5, the local control accountability planning associated with the local control funding formula of the County Office of Education or your districts, right? There are public health prevention allocations. CalAIM is an incredible opportunity to get upstream to whole child care. The Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act and the Youth Offender Block Grants in your probation shop, the State Mental Health Services Act, the MHSSA school grants that are present in many counties, and then there are other school-based prevention services. In order to figure out whether or not these leverage well, and most of them will, our local fiscal managers have to be engaged with each other to start the forecasting planning process and to weave these back through programs so that they can be applied, right? Either through a contract or indirect service if you're going to do it on your own as a county. So I can't emphasize too much that getting fiscal managers from the different components of your system of care together to learn about these kinds of funding streams. You don't have to know, it's highly detailed, right? So no one's going to learn everybody else's world in a detailed way, but you got to know it well enough and bring forward the parameters and the rules so that you can understand where the connection points can be and where they can't be, right? So get your fiscal managers together. And so let's look at a couple examples. Here are the State Mental Health Services and Schools Act grants that come out of the Office of the OAC at Mental Health Services Act. They distribute competitive grants to support specific initiatives, many. Some of them are listed here in terms of crisis response, and there are the school-based mental health services we're going to talk about. They have early intervention grants. The proposals that they put out are in support of stakeholder advocacy groups in many areas who are the same areas of kids who are the focal points under CPP. So here's this connective tissue, right? If these grants that the state's putting out under MHSSA are targeting these groups are often in same communities as the kids who are going to be the focal point of your CPP work, right? That should be clear, right? And so we want to leverage and take advantage of, if you're in a county where you've got these rich school resources, they could have been in place for a couple of years already, right? Because these have been out there for a while, but they're ongoing, they're cyclic. So weaving these into that planning process is super, super important. Let me pause and check chat. Good morning, Rocio in Santa Clara. You've got a question to me. Let me ponder on this. Yeah, how to get them to talk. Yeah. Good question. So Rocio posed a question around. I think how do you get them into relationships so that they can get to the details? And it's not easily done. If I were in a county planning, I would challenge and support my fiscal managers to have ongoing meetings around these opportunities so they can orient each other to this conversation. Otherwise, you'll get to a point in your planning process where they won't have enough detail and you'll end up with a fragmented plan to start off. Here's a second example of leveraging opportunity. The Department of Education has a CCSPP grant process. These are brand new. The California Community Schools, community school in a nutshell is a one-stop shop for kids associated with a school campus, right? Think of health and human services co-located within a school environment to foster wellness. That's prevention. And so the incredible opportunity here is to weave again this CCSPP program, and as you think about planning and implementation, to weave that in as part of your CPP comprehensive prevention planning work, right? So that you're connected. Schools are well positioned to be prevention partners for reasons we've talked about and we'll talk about a little bit more. And so figuring out how to connect these processes locally is an incredible opportunity. There are 4 key features that are required underneath the CCSPP grants. They have to contain integrated services and supports. They have to have high degrees of family and community engagement processes. They have to have collaborative leadership structures and extended learning time and opportunities. So these are all things that require the support of your interagency leadership team. There's no way that a school district can pull off those 4 demands underneath this grant if they're not in partnership with others. Now, you see the interdependence of the system of care partners now and the grant. And then a little more on this, it provides opportunities, but they're not limited, of course, to the alignment of the same kind of services and funding, which are components of your MOU. That's the whole point, right? Contact your local education authority, your SELPA director, your foster youth services coordinating program. Someone is administering this grant if they've gone after it. And there is a list here provided that you can find your local coordinators and engage in a conversation, get them connected to your effort. All right. I think I've made these points already, that this is the connection between community schools and system of care. There's an interdependence. The system of care's benefit is maximized when we have something like a one-stop shop, a community school, or a wellness center on a school campus. And the wellness center school campus can't be successful without partnership, because the people and resources that are going to sustain the school wellness program, they're only present in partnership. The school grants are grants. They're 3 to 5 year grants, right? And they're on cycles. And what we have historically done, this is another example of where we've tried to do reform work, but the dollars are often grant-based and they're cyclic. And if we're not in partnership, we can't sustain those grants. And so we churn through programs, right? We burn ourselves out developing new programs, and then within 1 or 2 or 3 grant cycles, we don't have any more money, so we can't do that program anymore. The solution to that problem, which is endemic, the solution is system of care, where you blend other revenues in support. And if we don't do CPP work from a system lens, we're gonna miss or not maximize the opportunity that's present within FFPSA Part 1. I hope that's super clear at this point. I think we'll pass on this for time, but schools can be fantastic partners in comprehensive prevention planning work. In addition to the community schools, which we just talked about, which is the 3rd bullet here, and the wellness centers that are closely related to them, schools are doing multi-tiered systems of support, often using their social emotional learning resources, dollars, to create and deliver interventions that are tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary supports in schools. And in many school districts and counties, there's a broad continuum of supports already in place. Those mechanisms, those tools can be part of your CPP work. They're not necessarily to comply with the state plan, but they enrich your plan significantly, right? So schools are great sources here. I mentioned this earlier, but when we don't blend and braid our dollars effectively, we're on this grant treadmill, right? Where we're constantly chasing the next bling, and we develop the program only to see it erode because the dollars end or because the grant ends, right? If we're not doing this work effectively together, then the system learning is stymied. And by that, I mean, we don't have longitudinal data that says there are outcomes that pay off over a period of time beyond the grant cycle. True implementation of most programs takes 5 to 8 years, which exceed the grant cycles in most cases, right? We also have job and position turnover because we fund people with grant dollars. And so people are in a job for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then they got to get another job because the grant ended. And we can end that so we can sustain the workforce. And if we don't blend our dollars effectively, then our community-based partners remain underfunded and dependent upon philanthropy or their private fundraising to sustain themselves, right? So there's tremendous value in figuring out the blending and sharing of dollars. Let me pause really quick. Any questions around the dollars, the blending and braiding? All right. Let's talk about the third element. We talked about governance, ILT. We talked about the dollars. Let's talk about data. It's one of the required elements, and it touches the CPP planning process in a couple of places, right? And existing partners in your system of care have data sources that are rich fonts of information. The mental health services planning, the local control accountability programming. Within the mental health plans, they do something called external quality review every year, and there is a performance improvement plan, and there is data within that EQRO that you could tap into to support your prevention planning. They have a triennial process of review by the state, and there's data, and we'll talk about that in some detail. There's cultural competency reporting with some data in it if the county is doing a really sophisticated job there. And the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, Youth Offender Block Grant reporting has data. System improvement, county self-assessment work, SIP work. If you're in child welfare probation, there's data there. Your First Five Commission has data to support its grant making. So this is a partial list again of all the places where partners have data that can be curated or mined to say, we're going to do the right thing with our prevention dollars. You don't have to recreate the wheel. You're going to have to kind of validate it probably. You'll want to do a little bit of data or metadata analysis at least, but you don't have to start from scratch. Here's a couple of examples. Within the triennial review process of your behavioral health services division or department or your mental health plan, they have a process where they have to communicate to the state what are our target populations and what are the demographics of that. And they have to evaluate on some level some data associated with identifying the age of the target, the race, ethnicity, primary language, sexual orientation, the veteran status, et cetera, right? So they have to cut and analyze data. And they have to do that to address problems that they've identified via that data analysis. The fundamental question that the triennial process, one of the fundamental questions that triennial review process that your behavioral health partners have to answer every 3 years is, how will the program, the mental health program, direct our services and activities to address one of the 7 negative outcomes that are defined in Welfare Institutions Code? Those 7 things are on the right. The state has identified 7 areas that can be your target or your focal point of your mental health services in your county. And so one or more of those is the target. Now, if you look at those 7 things, some of those 7 things relate closely to the kind of prevention work that's inherent within CPP work, right? Like unemployment is a predictor of child abuse and neglect. Homelessness correlates with child abuse and neglect. And then item 7 is obvious, right? Removing children from their home. That's a welfare thing, but you can see there may very well be data analysis information within the mental health plan's reporting and accountability process that would inform your CPP work here. Does that make sense? So this is technical stuff, but this is where the connective tissue is formed, knowing what these sources are. Here's a second example. Comes from schools. Local control accountability planning. It's an annual process. There's an allocation of dollars, and the district or the county office is required to develop, adopt, and annually update a 3-year plan. And within that plan, they have to identify local priorities. Read that language that's underlined. It's just like a CPP work, right? So think of LCAP as like a mini CPP at the district level. It has to include annual review of the effectiveness of those goals. There's data, what actions we're going to take, what services we delivered in the prior year. So this LCAP process, if we can tap it, and we can mine it as part of our CPP work, we've enriched our learning and understanding locally about what's going to work in our county or our jurisdiction. And relatedly, there's a fantastic data source that the Department of Education maintains called DataQuest. We'll give you that link. It may be in the resource document. If it's not, we can make sure we get it to you. But DataQuest is easily navigable, and data from every single district or county is available in DataQuest. And there's rich data there for CPP planners. A little more on this. Within that LCAP process, there is data on the frequency of external supports available in the school. So think about CPP now, and then look at what the LCAP partners have to do. They have to gather data on the number of agencies in the community that can support the school or the district, right? And very specifically, very prescriptively, how many English learning students are homeless or foster youth? How many English learning students experience trauma? How many parents are unemployed? These are all predictive correlates to child welfare entry. That is the target of your CPP work in FFPSA Part 1. Does this make sense? So get to your LCAP partners, get to their data. It's public data. There's no privacy or security issues around this. These are just reports. This is aggregated. So get that data and have it be your platform or augment or validate your CPP planning process. And I know we're racing through really quick here because I got just a couple more minutes. In the resource document that you've got, there's an example. Tiny Little Mono has done some really sophisticated work, and they've got a public dashboard. They got together and decided with some county direction that we wanted a child well-being dashboard, and their ILT oversaw this, and they developed 15 items, and it took them about 6 months. They shared it with some stakeholders in July of last year, and the learning from that process is now informing their CPP work. It's informing some housing grant work that their public health and social services people are doing. It's going to inform their system improvement plan and their county self-assessment for probation and welfare. So a really good example of where one process of outcomes analysis got woven together to inform multiple compliance activities. All right, let me try to wind up here really quickly and bring us home. But all system of care partners benefit from interagency prevention. We looked early on at some outcomes from system of care work. Well, here are those and a few others. Think again about the desired impact of a good prevention plan under FFPSA Part 1. Those goals are the same kind of goals that are present within system of care. And we get things within a high functioning system of care. We get things like increased school attendance, right? Decreased school expulsion, huge numbers in system of care jurisdictions across the country. This is not California data, this is national data, right? Reduced caregiver strain and improved family functioning. Well, that predicts child abuse and neglect entry points, right? Increased use and access to evidence-based practices is inherent within system of care. Why? Because your partners bring their interventions and resources to bear on behalf of the partnership. So people so kids and families in other sectors or other silos get access to those services. It's the purpose of system of care, right? Lower corrections involvement, less likely to spend time in an emergency room, almost a 50% decrease in inpatient use. These are phenomenal outcomes, the same kind of outcomes we're pursuing under CPP. So why wouldn't we do system of care and comprehensive prevention in tandem, like embed them within each other, right? So really quickly, recommendations. Make sure that your interagency leadership team or its designated management body, if you're using your prevention collaborative, that's great. Make sure they meet frequently and supportively. The administrative people have to be there to take minutes and agendas. The glue, the person or people responsible for the glue of that process, don't let that fragment, right? Make sure you got youth, parent, tribal voices in the system of care governance. If they're not in the MOU, which is likely, you got to figure out a way to open the ears of the executives locally to the people we're serving, right? We talked about this, but make sure that your CPP work is a standing agenda item in your ILT. Connect your fiscal manager, we emphasize that. And here again are some of the data sources. In addition to the ones we talked about in detail a minute ago, there's data in the maternal child infant health report from public health. Your mental health services planning process probably or should have data in it, et cetera. So there are lots of sources of data if you just know who to go to and how to tap that data. And some of it's just on the web, right? If you don't choose your ILT, you will need linkages and support again for governance work. And then from a big process standpoint, backing off just 1 second, if you're responsible for interagency leadership and system of care, in the next year or two, you're probably going to come up on a window to revise your MOU. And depending upon when your original MOU expires, please take the time to just take mental notes, if nothing else, like what have we learned and what are we doing now underneath the comprehensive prevention plan and the prevention work that we need to weave into the MOU. So your MOU, the revision process, would have space in it for saying, this is now how we approach prevention, and prevention is a focal point within our ILT System of Care 2083 work, if that makes sense. So you want to adapt and transform your MOU in light of what you're learning about prevention. Most important takeaways, and we'll I think be able to end here on time. There is way more bang for your prevention buck in system of care. The data, the dollars, right? The whole treadmill of short-term funding that's present in much of our formularies of how we fund program development, we short-circuit that. So programs become sustainable because we are linking dollars in ways that over time sustain them. There is reduced or shared administrative burden, right? Like if we can figure out, like Mono did, like how to do data sharing at the aggregate macro level, we can borrow data and reduce the amount of time it takes for me to do my report or my compliance activity because I'm borrowing the data that's present in my community. Same questions. We might ask those questions a little bit differently, but the data is the same. So that can all be adapted locally with your partners, right, to reduce the administrative burden. And ultimately, we get broader community impact, right? I will emphasize also as my last important takeaway that many times we don't know what our partners' experiences with evidence-based programs. I told you the story about this one county where they were sharing and it just mutually dawned on them that, oh, we're doing that EBP already. And neither of them knew that the other was doing it or intended to do it until they were in collaborative. So we can enhance the prevention services only when we are in the same sandbox together. All right, you've got a handout. I think it was in chat and will be available in some other form as well afterwards. But some of the resources that we think are super important to use here are listed here. So we won't belabor this, but you've got links in this document as well. And Haley has just dropped that into chat. Thank you. So happy to give a moment or two open space for reflections, observations, inquiry. If I was wrong about something, I love learning. So tell me if I was wrong. And let's talk about that. Otherwise, let's see. Molly, good question. You know, I have to disclaim that I'm not here today speaking for the state. I will just say that agencies, departments are working hard to develop some meaningful guidance that will inform your payer of last resort and your fiscal work. It's really complex stuff, and it's a moving target, right? Because of CalAIM and Medi-Cal reform and all that stuff. But they're working on it really hard. Patience, and I know you have been, but it's coming. It'll get here. All right. With that, I will yield back to Jessica and the team and express appreciation for inviting me into your space today. Thank you.
Great. Richard, we just want to thank you on behalf of the participants and on behalf of Caltrin. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing such valuable content. I do want to remind participants that this recording this session was recorded. So if you missed any part of it or if you want to go on back, we will be sending to your registration email a link on where you can watch that replay. You will now find in the chat, we're going to drop a copy of your survey link. This survey link will lead you to a brief survey followed by a certificate of attendance for today's session. So if you click that link, you'll be able to share with us and of course receive your certificate that you can save and print out. We will also be sending a reminder of that resources guide that was created for this session in that 2-day follow-up email. And with that, we want to thank you all for being here and we look forward to seeing you again. And thanks again, Richard.